What is power? To envision a sustainable future and work towards it? That's the power of purpose. To break the status quo and build the way forward. That's the power of innovation. To share knowledge and wisdom from generation to generation. That's the power of experience. To spark new discussions, find new answers, and explore new directions. That's the power of partnership. To go from you and me to us and we. That's the power of collaboration. To create space for problem solvers, pioneers, and change makers to shine. That's the power of people. To be reliable, renewable, and irreplaceable. That's the power of progress. And to make all this power flow together, that's the power of Axpo.
Halo, halo? O, teraz. Dzień dobry
Hello.
Państwu. Piotr
Good
Hałoń.
afternoon, Piotr Hałoń. I represent Deloitte Advisory. I'll have the pleasure of moderating this panel, the last but not least panel before the workshop. Just a short housekeeping note. The workshop ran by Pexa Park will begin at 4:15 in Warszawa, Kraków, or Warsaw, Krakow room, only for off-takers. Thank you for this note. All right, to press on. Ladies and gentlemen, today almost everything has been said about PPAs. At the end of the conference, we have this favorable role of summarizing the issue. So I have the huge pleasure of inviting Paweł Wierzbicki, member of the board Axpo Poland and a partner of our panel, to join us. Good afternoon. I'd also like to invite André Rørheim, representing DNB Markets, Krzysztof Müller, representing Alpiq Energy, Marta Oryl, head of the legal department of Vortex Energy Poland, and as a representative of off-takers, Szymon Kowalski from Resource Poland Hub, cooperating with off-takers and defending their interests on an everyday basis, I think I can say that. Welcome again. It's a pleasure to have you. As I said, we have this opportunity of summarizing the conference today. So a lot has been said by eminent experts about cPPAs. So let's start from a short summary so as to outline the issue, how trading companies define PPAs. I'd like to ask Paweł Wierzbicki to take the floor and to give us the simplest possible description of what PPA variants we have available today and how they function, how a trading company like Axpo approaches this issue. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you for the question. Let me start by a short explanation. Internally at Axpo, we always differentiate between PPAs and corporate PPAs. A PPA, the power purchase agreement, for many years now has been functioning on the market as an agreement between a trading companies or an off-taker taking electricity from the source, from a renewable source, and corporate PPA is a variant that's becoming more and more popular and more significant when we have two parties. We have the end user or the off-taker, who is a party to the agreement. So both, they can all be further subdivided into physical and financing agreements. Physical, that's one with physical flow of electricity, where the trading company provides balancing services and is responsible for trade balancing. And the financial agreement is different. It seems to be simpler at the first sight, where companies agree on settling the financial difference depending on the fluctuation of energy prices throughout the term of the contract. So we have a contract between an off-taker and a generator, and we have corporate PPA, and corporate PPAs are subdivided further into financial contracts between the end user that directly enters the contract with the generator, or physical contracts where to these two parties we add a trading company or a trader, which is a platform for the physical flow of electricity, provides balancing to both parties, buys, sells the surplus and shortage between the two parties, and also deals with additional issues like reporting, paying the excise duty, meeting all the requirements related to energy certificates, so to take some burden off the shoulders of the parties to the contract. So thank you. Paweł, since you have the mic, so you have the floor. Axpo. You have a huge breadth of skills, a lot of experience from Western markets, but what's the situation in Poland? We heard many times that there are a dozen or so such agreements concluded in Poland only. I spoke with Marta before we started the panel, and she noted that there are a lot of offers, but finally this does not convert into signed contracts. Why do you think is that? Thank you for the nice comment about our skills. We appreciate that as Axpo. Yes, we've been on the market for 20 years in Poland, in Europe much longer than that. From the very beginning, we've been seeing the development of a corporate PPA market. It is true, there were a few significant contracts entered into so far. Whether there were a couple or a few dozen or so, we don't really know, because they are not all published on the market. So some have non-disclosure agreements, clauses, and they are not published. But the majority is. In our opinion, I have not seen two identical cPPAs yet. They have different conditions, we have different end users, we have different generators. There are different ways of financing employed. The equity share can be larger or smaller. The project can be sell on auctions or not. From the point of view of off-takers, we have huge companies that can accept certain risks, or we have smaller entities that are not really that prone to have such a high risk appetite. So every contract is different. And developing a contract between 3 or 2 parties takes a lot of time. We are in, well, today everyone has a lot on their plates, and it doesn't help, obviously. So the talks are ongoing, but it takes from a few to a dozen or so months to really conclude such a contract. Thank you. I called you to the floor in a way, but in reference to what Mr. Wierzbicki said, you represent a generator, Vortex Energy, Vortex Energy Group. And from your point of view, what kind of risks, because that's the topic of the panel, what kind of risks must a generator face?
Good afternoon. Well, looking as a generator, I see a lot of risks, and most of these risks have already been mentioned during the previous panels. One of the biggest risks is that of price, and it has been discussed in quite detail. Depending on the type of contract, this risk tends to materialize at a different place or a different point in time. But actually, this kind of risk is something that a generator cannot anticipate, or the rest of the parties to any contract cannot anticipate it either. And from what we hear, risk appetite is not so huge on part of the other cPPA participants. So yeah, both parties will have to somehow compromise and will have to somehow give something for this market to really work. I think another big risk that for some developers, for some generators who are also developers, another big risk that occurs is bankability, the risk of such a PPA not being all that bankable. And it's been mentioned before, just like Paweł said, there are no two agreements that would be the same. Therefore, generators, until they start negotiating, until they start getting experience, until they initially get burned, they cannot compare their contract to anything else. Even if they had some relations, some business partners and so on, still getting all the knowledge, getting all the know-how is very difficult. There are some other risks, generator-related risks or business partner-related risks, so off-takers risk. Like, for example, the risk of failure to build. So a certain renewable source a certain project may not be built simply. And this risk really tends to happen when a PPA is signed before construction started. So if such a risk materializes, compensation has to be paid to the partner. So again, it's good to be aware of this risk and to secure yourself from it. Another risk could be the off-taker themselves. It could be, well, the bankability of the generator, the standing of the generator, it's all important, but banks look at off-takers as well. Of course, in the ideal world, a generator would like to get a bank guarantee or an insurance guarantee if off-taker doesn't pay them. But, well, I think we have a long way to go to get strong enough for us as generators to be able to dictate this. Of course, we can use corporate guarantees, right? Or we can have a shorter settlement period that would minimize our risk of loss of liquidity. Also, I would like to say something about another risk. I don't think anyone mentioned it before, namely regulatory risk. The risk that the law will change to the extent that parties will have a problem performing under their agreement. Such risks have happened, in history when I look at this industry. So yes, it makes sense to really make sure to secure yourself against this kind of risk. Like, for example, maybe to have a clause, a renegotiation clause, for example, in the contract, so that, you sit back at the table and bring the balance back, bring the symmetry back. Or maybe to have a good definition of force majeure in the contract. Right. You talked about regulatory risk, sure. Paweł mentioned that no two PPAs are the same. Do you think that making PPAs standard or making them more standardized, just like with electricity, for example, maybe this would make sense for you as a generator. Sure, absolutely. I agree. I even urge all the different people to try and push in this direction, and it would even speed up the development of our industry. Because right now, generators face so many dilemmas, so many challenges. They're getting quite a lot of bids. Quite a lot of companies are interested in purchasing power of them, but still, these offers are very enigmatic, very unclear. It's always like, the devil lies in the details. So the more standardized these agreements, the better for everyone, I would say. Krzysztof, hypothetically speaking, we have a PPA, let's say, standard text. But of course, the devil is in the details, as someone said. It's very important what the settlement mechanism will be. So what about your company, Alpiq? How do you approach this? How do you solve this kind of a challenge? Well, when we're talking about cPPAs, Alpiq, my company, is not a party or is never a party to it, we do not negotiate the formula between the off-taker and the generator, right? We're not a party here, but we try to advise and consult with both parties. I'm not sure if this is if this is Alpiq corporate policy or whether it's my own idea, but we always suggest mixed approaches, mixed formulae. When we talked about inflation marked or inflation index, I think this is our typical Polish specificity. Everyone is looking at the CPI, right, at the consumer price index. And given what's happening right now with inflation, maybe over 3 to 4 years your price can double when you look at CPI, right? CPI. And all those indexes, all those indices may really be different. Like, for example, on the Turkish market, their inflation officially is 70%, officially. But independent consultants and independent companies who are independent from the Turkish National Bank, they're saying that the number is twice as much. So this really matters when you're entering into long-term contracts. So to us, we think a mixed approach is good, trying to share the risk and try not to eliminate the component of wholesale power prices. So briefly speaking, to make the long story short, if I want the off-taker and the generator to meet somewhere halfway, I would say, let's stick to the CPI, but 50%. And the other percent of it, let's take another index from the wholesale market, for example. Of course, there might be more than one index. All of these indices may lead to certain different risks, right? And there is the mythical figure called the bank. And the bank might say, or the parties might say, I would agree, me too, but what about the bank? Banks, they like simple things, like CPI. Banks tend to like simple things. André, so we assumed that I would be asking my questions in Polish. So Krzysztof spoke before you, and he talked about how contracts can be secured, what kind of collaterals you can introduce, because everyone will say it's expensive and so on, what to do, how to secure ourselves. So what about DNB markets? How would you like to make those contracts safe? I mean, for the generator, and maybe also from the point of view of traders, how to try to make this contract safer, more secure.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. So I think, yes, I work with the PPA Origination and a PPA advisory for DNB, who is a bank. So yes, we are very much concerned about the bankability of PPA. That's a very important question. And so the issue of security or collateral is very important. So I think today this panel is about the role of the traders, right? And the traders have a very good understanding of how the security works. But I think that I would also like to mention that, the traders are very important, but for the long-term functioning of the market, also the corporates are, you know, an incredibly important part of the market, because there is a limited amount of risk that the traders can have. They need to offset the exposure they are taking, and so you need the energy consumers to come into the market and participate in the PPA market. That is very important. And so many of these consumers, the energy consumers who are looking at PPAs, they don't have that much experience with negotiating PPAs, and especially this issue of security can become an issue. It's a very important part of the PPA agreement. So I would like just to say a few things about it. So when you enter into PPA agreement, you have to be prepared to put up security for the contract. And the question is, so why is that? Well, as an example, say that you enter into a PPA for 100 gigawatt hours for 10 years. That's basically a contract with 1 terawatt hour exposure. So 1 million megawatt hours. And you have a fixed price agreed to buy. So say that now a very volatile market, say that the market moves 100 zloty lower. So the value of the total contract has decreased by 100 zloty per megawatt hour. You have 1 million megawatt hours, so it's like 100 million zloty lost in the value of the contract. And say that the consumer defaults in this position. Then the bank has leveraged the seller's project with a value that was 100 million zlotys higher. And the bank needs some guarantee for that risk. That is why we have these guarantees from the buyer. So how much guarantee do you have to give? What is the sizing of the guarantee? And here there are different approaches. One approach in a 10-year PPA could be, for example, my colleagues could tell you, as an example, 1 year exposure. So out of 10 years contract, you have a guarantee for 1 year, which just continues every year. Another approach could be that you have, say, 15% of the total contract value, and it's reduced linearly every year. So the less years, the smaller the contract. So there are various ways you can do that, but you should expect at least to have something like 1 year of exposure covered in a contract, or 15% of nominal value as a rule of thumb, not written in stone, but just general. And I just also would like to add that some companies think that this is conservative or expensive. And I just would like to give you an example to show you that this is not conservative and not expensive. Because the volatility in the market now in Poland, like all markets, is huge. So if you have a 15% covered as a guarantee of the nominal value, the market can move much more than that within just a month. So it's actually not a very conservative sizing of a guarantee. And just to give you an example, if you were hedging power on a power exchange, first you have to put around 15% of the contract value as initial margin, collateral, cash, and then every day you have to post negative value of the contract in cash. So it's variable. First 15%, then every day the negative value. You don't know what your total exposure is going to be. With the PPA guarantee, at least you know this is the contract size. It's not a big risk. So what type of guarantees can you give? Well, if you are an investment grade company, you are very lucky. You can use the parent company guarantee. If you're a subsidiary of an investment grade company, you're also very lucky. You can use the parent company guarantee. If you're not investment grade company, which many are not, then you have to look to a bank guarantee. That is the most common. So you have to, in the PPA kind of cost, you have to assume also a cost for a bank guarantee of roughly 10-15%, or maybe even more now with volatility, of the contract value. But that is, compared to other sources of hedging, it's not a very expensive way of security.
Thank you so much. Panie Szymonie.
Szymon, So in reference to André said, representing off-takers, all kinds of off-takers or end users, how would you define the expectations towards trading companies, but also banks? But let's focus on trading companies. Thank you for the invitation to the panel. Just by way of introduction, on an everyday basis, I work at Research Hub, but I also support off-takers in their negotiations and trading companies. That's why I rose to the challenge of representing off-takers here, because in our conversations with trading companies, I usually take their side. So what are the expectations? The one main expectation is as follows: to have a low price, to have affordable solutions for the off-taker to enter into the contract and to buy the electricity at the lowest price possible. But not only that, off-takers today, to a large extent, in comparison to trading companies, generators are not professional. It's not their core business, really, to purchase electricity. Usually they are learning more and more. They are forced by the market, and I would expect trading companies to provide some support or consultancy here, especially in corporate PPAs, where these contracts are really complex. I agree there are many types of contracts. It's difficult to create a single standard. We have an EFT standard, but can it be directly implemented? No. I give them these standard contracts and they still fail to understand anything, and this is not I'm not criticizing them. They don't really have to understand this. This is not their core business. Their core business is to manufacture things in specialized industries, and electricity is just one of the costs for them. They don't have to be experts in that. Here is the role of a trading company. Most often, they are not a direct party of the PPA. Usually, as a rule, a PPA does not cover generating units, so this is a contract between a generator and off-taker. And in the case of physical contracts, we usually have a trading companies involved that actually closes the contract, balances it, sells the surplus electricity, or because most of contracts offered by generators are pay as produced, so they are transferring all the risks to the off-taker. Today, both generator and the trading companies do not want to accept any risks. All of the risk is transferred to the off-taker, to the end user. So, with the current electricity prices, the off-taker very often, well, maybe is not in a lost position, but in a worse position, because they are offered cheaper electricity. And through many regulations we've covered today, competition is limited, the supply of sources is limited. The off-taker has to accept many risks, and the role of the trading company could be like a provider, intermediary, like a facilitator, really. They should lead the off-taker by the hand and to teach them the ropes, to show them what the margin is of the trading company. Most often it's related to the volume of electricity. So it's in addition to this. So looking at my colleagues here, I think it's possible to be more proactive. I would like to encourage you to do that from my own experience. I have to give the floor to Krzysztof. I think that he was called to the floor, in a way. The role of the trading company as a messenger of bad news to the off-taker or to the end user, well, it's very important, but it's not a nice role to play. I'd like to point your attention to the fact, to what Szymon said. Pay as produced plus inflation rate. That's the desired model, while off-takers have a different take on that. They like to have pay as consumed and a fixed price for 3 years. So it takes some effort from both parties, really, to fill the gap. but no effort from the trading company will ensure this. There are some trading companies, okay, who offer such services, but in my opinion, these are the trading companies who are planning in the short term. Now, for all those present here, I suggest to pay attention to the fact whether the goods that are offered are not too beautiful to be true. Well, I didn't want what I said to sound that trading companies are not operating well. What I'm saying is that they could be more proactive in their approach and to raise the awareness of off-takers. From my own experience, because I took part in some transactions or just power purchase agreements, the off-takers don't understand your offering because it's structured in such a way that even for me as a professional, it's somehow difficult to decipher all this. So using this opportunity to defend the off-takers, I like to call on you to have a more proactive approach towards the off-taker. And Paweł, how would you respond to that call for action? I'd like to put the ball in your court now, as that's the basis for every contract, not only a corporate PPA, but in any sector, for all the parties involved to fully understand the contract, what they're doing, which risks they are taking, what they are hedging against, and this is of key importance. And we have to be blunt about it, that trading companies have a certain advantage here towards the generators and end users. And there are some exceptions. There are generators with a rich international history and competences. The same goes for off-takers. But to have a level playing field, to achieve Zen, you need transparency and openness. So this might be down to earth, but all the processes are very formalized. We have advisors on the side of the generator and off-taker who run these processes. This is covered by NDAs, procedures, and generally speaking, some information comes in, but nothing comes out. It's difficult really to be on the same page, really, because we don't have this openness, we don't have dialogue. And the result is a bit different than this desired one. So I do agree. So all the parties have to fully understand the contract. If not, something wrong might happen. And one party might be dissatisfied. It may end up with a more or less formal dispute. But to be on the same page, you need to have this openness during negotiations and talks. So if we have such contracts concluded in Poland, a dozen or so, or a few dozen or so, well, it would seem that it is possible to reach a compromise, like a win-win-win formula. Now, André would like to take the floor, right? But if I could comment on that, there are only 18 PPAs. Is that a lot or not, in the context of what you said? Obviously. Let me refer to what you said, because we're saying that FET is an example. FET is a standard of sorts. If you sign it, it doesn't change, but there are annexes to it, where we change everything from the standard, really, according to the expectations and needs of the parties. So, for corporate PPAs, there aren't two contracts that would be the same. For one end user, the profile is not enough. They will use the volume anyway, and their exposition to the current market is zero. For other entities, the need of providing collateral or hedging is a challenge, because the rating company, the mother company doesn't have a rating, and they need to take a different approach. So we need a standard, that's true, because it regulates some issues, but still the devil is in the details. We always have an annex to the contract, depending on the risks, how they want to spread the risk. The standard will be modified or customized. Now, André, would you like to take the floor? I thought that you raised your hand.
Maybe just to add one comment to this, because we work as a PPA advisor, so we speak to many of the traders in the market. And just to give a little bit of defense to the traders, I think that we see a lot of proactivity and creativity among the traders, offering new and interesting products for projects. I think that one area we see that it could make the situation easier also for the traders who are providing liquidity in the market is to increase the number of corporates who are also engaged in the PPA market. Because trading houses, they have limited risk mandates. They cannot absorb all the risk. They need end users also to offload their risk. And so I think that at least what we're seeing now, for example, there is a limited supply of PPAs because renewable projects, they have access to the CFD market and also very often a preference for the CFD market. Banks likes the CFD market. So there is a limited supply of projects for the corporate PPAs. And we are seeing, for example, the tech companies, the technology companies who have high targets for sourcing green power, they are paying what seems to be a premium also on the pricing. So they are taking a lot of this PPA volume also. So I think that in the Polish market, the end users, the corporate consumers, also need to, increase the pace of stepping into the PPA market, because I know that many companies have high targets for sourcing green power, and unfortunately prices have gone up very quickly, very high. So prices currently are not in the range where many corporates should wish they were, but I think that what we need to see is more corporates also entering in the market to add more demand from the end users. That could also help trading houses in structuring agreements, I think.
André w pewnym sensie powiedział, w którą
André, you told us in which direction the market should develop. Now, reaching the end of our discussion, Krzysztof, now lowering the volume or going down to the smaller entities, SMEs, do you think that is the right way to go? Should we follow this path to develop this formula of selling electricity? Yes, it's one of the paths possible. As the speakers before me mentioned, trading companies, by very definition, need to be risk-averse. They should avoid excessive exposure to a single customer. So corporate PPAs is provided by the largest companies and makes sense. On the other hand, transferring towards ever smaller off-takers actually makes the very concept of a PPA disappear, because we're returning to such a situation. We as a trading companies enter into a contract with the generator, and this offload of risk is done on the basis of a dozen or so entities. So returning to the typical PPAs that we've had for many years now on the market. It might happen like that, especially if we see something that seems impossible today, of a longer price drop period. This might return, the situation might return, because the premium for entering into long-term agreements will disappear. They will stop being attractive first for the smallest companies. Now, for a generator, what are the prospects? As I understand, reducing prices is not what you would expect. Which direction should the market go? I think that from the point of view of the generator, the market will remain attractive as long as it has a price advantage over the auction-based system. Looking at the current forecast of electricity prices, such a situation should maintain in the years to come. But there's one aspect: these sources must be developed. A lot of time was devoted to barriers today, barriers to the development of new energy sources. We have to state it clearly again. We have to reiterate that from the point of view of generators, according to the current framework, we won't have more new sources developed. On the other hand, on one hand, the RES industry has been waiting for the liberalization of the 10H Act, or the Distance Act. On the other hand, there's a new draft law that totally changes the zoning principles according to this draft law. It is currently being debated on developing utility PV farms, the ones that would be very much attractive in the system from the point of view of PPAs, will be a long-term process. According to the current shape of the draft law, the provisions are that the location of such farms will be possible only based on the local zoning plan. There's a difficult situation in the grid. There's a higher share of refusals of applications for connection conditions, which does not translate into development of new sources. So these are all the barriers. We can overcome all of them, but this requires cooperation. Szymon, which way should the market go? We should go green. So, which path should we take for corporate PPAs? I think that today there are many types of contracts that could be called corporate PPAs. We're talking virtual, physical, lease, solar as a service. So this is also a type of a PPA. So I think it's difficult to say which way we should go. So the more types, the better. The easier it is for off-takers to acquire clean energy, the better for everyone, for all the interested, for all the stakeholders, including trading companies who will be really making these contracts work. But the price is the decisive factor, really. It should be set at a reasonable level. I don't want to tell you what it is. Well, let's call it reasonable. Today, the commodity stock exchange price is very high. We will see what happens in 5 or 7 years. There's a lot of PV in the system. It might lower the price in certain times of the day and the year. But the question is whether contracts with today's prices at 700 or 600 zlotys, whether they will be attractive in 5 or 7 years' time. So my recommendation is as follows. Let us build as many types of contracts possible, both for generators to develop and for off-takers to use this opportunity. This includes, obviously, trading companies.
I feel that maybe you have not enough faith in the Polish nuclear, but actually there will be so much more low emissions or no emissions energy very soon. Hopefully, let us hope. And on this optimistic note, I would like to say thank you for this panel, and hopefully this knowledge pill proved enough for you. Thank you so much to all my panelists. onto the
Będziemy się zajmować i bardzo dobrze.
onto the issue of
W końcu
cPPAs,
do,
because this is something we need to deal
do głosu
with.
w tej dyskusji
In
o
the end,
kierunkach
finally,
transformacji dopuszczamy klientów,
we
dopuszczamy
are
ich
allowing
potrzeby,
customers,
dopuszczamy te
clients
firmy,
to
które
have a
za tą
voice,
zieloną energię
and we're
odpowiadają
allowing
i są w stanie
companies who are behind this
podjąć
green
rękawice
energy
i
to have a
zmieniać naszą
voice.
rzeczywistość.
They are ready to raise up to the
miejscu
challenge
chciałem też serdecznie
and
podziękować
help us
naszym
change our
partnerom,
lives.
przede wszystkim
I would like to
firmie,
thank
która
our
nas wspiera w
partners.
organizacji,
Our
czyli
main partner
Respect Energy.
is Respect Energy.
I zapraszając jeszcze Państwa
And,
na
well,
kolację, w czasie
before I
której
invite
będziemy
you to
mieć
dinner,
niezwykle
and
interesującą
over dinner we'll
prezentację,
have a very
jak
interesting
kryteria
presentation
szczególnie w obszarze klimatu
about
i
ESG
środowiska,
and how
determinują,
ESG, especially in terms of
przechodzenie
climate and
firmy na
environment,
rynku, ale jeszcze
dictate
wcześniej
that companies
będziemy
go
mieć
green.
okazję i tutaj,
But before that,
przekazuję głos
there'll be another
do przedstawiciela,
another
Respect Energy.
thing that we'll need to take care of.
Following popular demand, I'll just speak English. Hope that's okay. A big thank you to Resource for organizing this conference. Thank you to the panelists for a good discussion. And without further ado, please join me for a snack and a cocktail right by the Respect Energy stand. Of course, brought to you by Respect. Thanks.
Thank you.